Welcome, everybody, to this session on Archetypes and Egregores. We've had one of these sessions in the network so far, and now there's also been an underground philosophy event. So it's been a topic that's been present with me for several months now in terms of preparations and writings, and I'm curious what Tim is going to bring to it. There are so many different ways into this, and I think one of the reasons I like this topic from a voicecraft perspective is that it almost purposefully eludes clear technical delineation. We can approach it this way, we can approach it that way. And for the sake of understanding and conversation, we obviously want to be clear about how we're approaching it. And I'm not against people making strong arguments as to we should definitely not approach it like this, or we should approach it like this. But from the outset of inviting people into conversation, if you have an interest in Jung, that's going to motivate you perhaps towards seeing archetypes in a certain way. And then, of course, from an anthropological perspective, you might take a little bit more of the mystification out of it, might be more focused on sociology and roles and external constraints rather than seeking an exploration of some sort of collective unconscious, however that's instantiated. And in the case of egregores, you can approach it from a more rationalist perspective, again, which looks more towards external constraints and incentives that are imposed through system. And we sort of look at some aggregate effect of how people are behaving and then offer it some personification if you wanted to be really hard-nosed about it. Or you might, on the opposite side of things, see the possibility of some ritualized collective manifestation. And then somewhere in the middle is a lot of, I think, fruit to explore at the level of thought forms, feedback loops, hyperstition, spirit of a group. What's the relationship between egregores and archetypes in terms of how one may appear later, perhaps in the evolutionary process? One might argue archetype, as etymologically meaning original pattern, is a term that deserves a basis further back in history, how one wants to instantiate that metaphysically. Of course, there's lots of breakpoints there in terms of, is the world, is nature, is cosmos fundamentally unchanging? Is there some platonic whatever that sits behind? Or in fact, is the world a little bit more open in its potentiality and change a little bit more of an active part, a real part of cosmos? Anyway, so many ways in, and there are some, I think, really alive threads among us that will no doubt shape this in a particular way. But Tim, as our guest for this session, I am curious for you to share a few of the frames you bring and also your interest in this topic, because you did message me with an interest in having this conversation. So I'm curious what draws you to it.
Yeah, great introduction, and thanks for having me, Tim, as always. And yeah, really looking forward to this chat. I mean, yeah, look, there are a lot of different ways to approach this topic. It's one of the, in a sense, it's a kind of a theme that runs through perhaps the whole of the history of certainly Western philosophy and maybe just philosophy in general. So, putting it in a historical context, I think, is really important. So that's one thing we can do, and I'll get to that in a moment. I mean, a very brief sketch of that because it's huge. In another sense, what my interest is, a lot of my thinking is in a way against archetypes or against a certain way of thinking or reifying or hypostasizing, certainly against the notion of a static archetype, against eternal forms of definiteness. I'm not into those, if anybody knows my thinking a little bit. I'm a kind of anarchistic philosopher in a way. I mean, I prefer to think of it as ontogenetic thought, but it's anarchistic in the sense that I can't abide the arche which attempts to erect itself or be erected by those who support it as sort of sovereign or eternal or authoritarian and all of that sort of stuff. But I also have a very long-term interest in Jung, and Jung is a thinker that himself doesn't admit it, as we know, of easy reduction. He has very sort of process-oriented aspects to his thought, but then he has what might be called more essentialist aspects to his thought. And of course, the notion of archetype and how it functions in his thinking is one of these key areas where we get a bit of an essentialist take and maybe a little bit of a process take as well. And again, that's very consistent with the history of the concept and the way different thinkers have worked through it. So that's really interesting. And Jung is inheriting something very specific and clear, and he's not shy about discussing his influences, right? So it's sort of important to put him in that context, I think, to understand, what he does that's novel with a concept like archetype and what he's inheriting directly from a philosophical context, which, I'm a biologist by training, and it's also very much a biological context, actually, that he's inheriting this notion from. But yeah, within Jungian thought, it's of course famously, a somewhat ambiguous concept, and different people who are either championing or criticizing Jung have taken this notion of the archetype as a kind of fulcrum as well. And so, yeah, you sort of gesture towards different ways of thinking about archetypes, even in the context of Jung's thought. Is it a biological notion? Is it an anthropological notion? Is it a sort of a psychological notion, if we're distinguishing that from an anthropological notion? Is it indeed a metaphysical notion? And I do have a way that I come at this. And so before I get into a history, which I do think is worth doing, I would just say that, the way I can make use of a concept like archetype is in terms of thinking of archetypes or archetype as a kind of operator, right? It's not a thing. It's an operator that is associated with inheritance of a certain kind of pattern. So in a biological register, I might say it canalizes the inheritance of a lineage, right? So it would be relevant in discussing the history of archetypal biology to talk about Darwin as well, which might seem counterintuitive. I mean, not again, if you've ever listened to me, I'm going to make things circle around Darwin one way or another. But yeah, so I think of it as an operator. So one of the first things to say is that, yeah, it's not a thing for me. And Jung is relatively clear about this as well. So it'd be important to talk about the distinction between the archetype as such and archetypal images in Jung. It'd be then important in that context to talk about Immanuel Kant and what he's getting from Kant. But yeah, I mean, super briefly, and we can unpack this more, like thinking about a history of this concept. I'll touch on egregore really, really briefly before I shut up. But thinking about a history of this concept, it's an ancient concept, right? So you can think Plato and the forms. You can certainly think Aristotle. Yes, kind of original pattern, originary pattern, principle, arche, principle, origin, literally the archetype, the stamp, the seal that stamps the wax, that imprints the form on the wax. So there's this whole hylomorphic thing going on in philosophy, like, hule is matter, morphe form, and in a sort of vulgar hylomorphic concept, you have the notion of the form preceding the matter, and the matter either being shaped by an external demiurge, or perhaps like an artisan, basically, right? Or perhaps somehow the form as an active principle itself that is shaping the matter in its own image. And then we can talk about those contexts, and then they're very important. And we can then jump 2,000 plus years to Immanuel Kant and his mobilization of the notion of archetype in the intellectus archetypus, the archetypal intellect. And the role of kind of archetypes as a priori filters of perception, which is something that Jung is taking up. And then where the term really actually gets a lot of currency is in archetypal biology, and that's Goethe, the Erbpflanz, the kind of the herb plant, the leaf, and then a bunch of biologists that follow Goethe. So this is like a period in the late 18th and early 19th century when biology is just emerging as a science. And embryology is this key site of sort of theoretical and scientific, conceptual innovation and everything, trying to understand how does the embryo go from this apparently undifferentiated state to, the mature organism. And we have there, contrast between preformationist and epigenetic conceptions. This all gets really important in the development of evolutionary thought. But archetypal biology is one of these major currents there. And so from Goethe to Lawrence Oken to another Carl Gustav Carus. And he's really important to Jung. If you've read a lot of Jung, he will talk about Carus all the time. And he thinks that Carus is actually the first philosopher to basically have a kind of systematic philosophy of the unconscious. So, there's all of that, details in embryology, etc. And then there's Darwin, who is very much inheriting this idea of archetypes, in fact. And the kind of basic idea with archetypal biology would be that, form in some way precedes function, that there's a form that is possibly ideal, like in the mind of a divine intellect again, or whatever, maybe not, but that the derivations and variations of a lineage are essentially kind of like variations on a theme, and that this theme somehow predates the whole lineage. So for the Urpflanz and Goethe, it's like the leaf, the basic leaf, and then all the different parts of the plant are variations on that theme. And, people like Oken and Carus and Richard Owen in England, and that, they're trying to think of like the vertebrate body plan as this archetype that all vertebrates share and whatever. And Darwin's really, really exercised by that, and he kind of accepts that there's a fundamental truth there. But again, there's all these devils in the details, because lots of people are thinking about these things in different ways. Of course, Darwin is trying to, well, he doesn't know that he's trying to do this, actually, so I don't want to put words in his mouth too much. But what he ends up doing is kind of immanentizing this process, right? So, and removing the recourse that earlier thinkers may have had, or even contemporary thinkers may have had, to a kind of ideal or transcendent form. And so for Darwin, the form becomes like the inheritance, right? So it's a sign of a common ancestry, which is a very much a more material, immanent thing. So, he will talk about the archetype in the context of the vertebrate hand, or foot, paw, etc. Why does a mole and a human have a structurally similar hand when we clearly are very different from moles and we do very different things, and blah, blah, blah. And he will start to interpret this in terms of shared ancestry. But so again, this archetypal operator is this pattern or form or whatever that's being inherited in a lineage and being deviated within the lineage. The real radical difference with Darwin is that form itself, now we have an account of the genesis of the form itself in principle, right? So forms themselves have geneses, but then they stabilize in a certain way, and they, canalize and influence and whatever their inherited ongoing evolution. And, blah, 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 blah. I'm about to shut up, promise. One of the thinkers that I am particularly interested in, who I think, radicalizes and brings together a lot of the different things we've just talked about, is Gilbert Simondon. And he is inheriting from Jung, but he is very Darwinian in the structure of his thought, and blah, 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 blah. So there's a lot to say about that if we want to go there. The egregore thing, it's a really fascinating and different another concept, which there are lots of structural similarities with egregores as operators with archetypes, right? Especially if we're thinking about the mode of genesis of an archetype, right? So an egregore you could think of as a particular kind of archetype that has a particular kind of genesis. It, for example, in sort of like, collective human behaviors generating psychic energy and blah, blah, like the classic kind of account of an egregore. There's a really fun story to tell, I think, about the Book of Enoch and the origins of the notion of the egregore, and I have been toying with for a while, and I want to do more with a kind of Jungian Simondonian reading of the Book of Enoch, just because that's like fun. But that's where the term, like the watcher idea, comes from. So that's a cool thing to talk about. So just like in summary, the way I think about archetypes as operators, it's never a question for me of like, oh, are they biological, or are they metaphysical, or are they blah, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, they're all of those things, right? Or whatever. This operation is a generic operation, right? So it's found in all these different discourses or domains of reality or whatever, or however you want to think about that. And so the question really isn't, and here I do really follow Jung, I think, because I have a very profligate notion of realism. I'm like, yeah, all this stuff is real because it's efficacious. It's real because it has an effect in the world. And that's not dissimilar to Jung's notion of psychic reality. And so then the question is, given that I have this sort of thoroughly ontogenetic view, it's like, so the questions are like, how does this thing come to be? What powers indeed, or, does it have? How does it influence the evolution of a lineage? How is it inherited? Blah, 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 blah. It's never like, is it real or is it unique to this kind of domain? It's a generic operation that is differentially realized in all these different domains. And so the interesting questions become like the detailed accounts of how this operation is realized in any given domain or any given like empirical example or whatever.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, well, I'm going to say a couple things here just in terms of how maybe good to progress this conversation, because I'm feeling like it'd be really nice to hear from everybody who wants to sort of bring themselves into the space, which means we'll do that before passing it back to Tim. And that's only if people want to, of course, there's no pressure there. And that in the process, maybe, of sharing what we are picking up on and what we're interested to bring in, that will then fuel a response Tim can give and that we can all take on later. So I'm feeling energetically that might be a good thing to do. There's a couple things that I would love to bring in as well, just by reference to where I feel my dialogue with Tim is, or at least picks up on some of the threads of conversation we've had over the years that relates to this topic, and I think points toward where maybe among the more interesting generative edge for all of us perhaps to explore. And Tim is partly pointing towards it there by in the end of his expression, by pointing towards maybe some of the more specialized questions as to how the operator of archetype has influenced a particular domain. But I think the emergence of a domain, or the shift or relation between domains with respect to how we participate in creativity, the title of the episode that we recorded on the podcast was Towards a Philosophical Science of Purposeful Transformation, which is one of Tim's phrases, but we'll often talk about something similar. And I'm always going on about what does it mean to participate in transformation, and, notions of telos are sort of interesting to all of us. So who are we and how do we participate? How do we influence? As a point of interesting reference, Michael Garfield brought up in the last podcast the notion of flatlanders, that famous book and notion. And there is something playfully interesting there in considering what dimensions, used loosely at this point, of reality, whether that are presently enacting influence, having effects that we may be otherwise unaware of, or that perhaps may be in some sense latent or, potentially available to become, which could massively influence the ecology that we're a part of. So examples I can think of in our time are games, whether virtual reality or just World of Warcraft or something like this. At a certain level, you can think about that as the creation of a dimension in which a whole bunch of meaning making and time and energy can be invested. Whole economies built. And so I do think it's really peculiar to our time to consider our capacity to create, build alternate dimensions. Now, how we might qualify those in terms of whether or not those are almost something like quasi dimensions in the sense of they're subjugating and they're actually just, one of the many nested possibilities associated with already existing technology that wants to influence according to some economic model or something like that. Or whether in the cultivation of some game-like environment might actually create the constraints that enable some intelligent process to come together to invent new technology, whether social technology or it could be code in a game, or, some type of way of behaving together, which then actually allows a certain kind of participation in the physical world. A bunch of kids getting together on Minecraft and inventing a rocket ship would be like a funny example, right? But what sort of, whether they're sandboxes or whether they're, openings up into contact with the DMT entities. Do you know what I mean? Like that would be the other way to sort of look at what kind of dimensional, what additional possibilities for communication are there and participation. And applying the lens of archetype and egregore in such contexts, I think, is then quite interesting. We can take on some of the way Tim's framed that there. And I could go into that a little bit more. Tim, I think you'll really enjoy a conversation I had, well, maybe you will, at one of the segments in Underground Philosophy was very much, I was with Nick, who you've spoken to, Dr. Nick. And he's, in some respects, quite an essentialist when it comes to Gnostic, mystic philosophy, oneness, and I was obviously coming from a more processual perspective, and that played itself out in quite a beautiful way, I thought, anyway. Okay, so toward this new or ulterior dimension of possibility and how archetypes may inform how we organize ourselves or interpret that landscape, and then egregores perhaps as something a little bit more with the notion of the watcher. If I speak, poetically, it speaks a little bit more to sort of conscious creation in a sense. Watcher, awake. It's almost as if, the apprentice is taking the tools of the master without necessarily coming from a fully integrated understanding about some archetypal, the archetypal operators in question, but going, all right, let's play with this particular kind of energy. Let's constellate this particular kind of pattern. And maybe we can create something and it's going to have a real effect. And a couple hundred years later, everybody's eating McDonald's across the whole world. Not even a couple hundred years, obviously, whatever, 50 years, 60 years. So football clubs may be a good example. Nation states, who knows? But to this notion then, Tom, maybe I could just ask you to share if there are any threads you're picking up on that you'd like to sort of bring into the context, and then we'll ask Aspasia, Jan, and Beck if you would like to share anything as well.
Nice. Yeah, thanks, Tim. I'm just going to take a second. There's quite a bit floating around. Yeah, so I think there's two pieces I'm kind of holding at least in the foreground. One was coming through there, and it was just the sense of like, how do we relate to the virtual, and kind of holding the virtual in this both like metaphysical sense, but also in the digital sense, and kind of these ways of augmenting that relationship between actuality and potentiality. And Michael Evans' work kind of flashed in, and thinking about that as this kind of strange interface where the biological is meeting the virtual in this very real way, as opposed to like virtual reality and meta and whatnot, where it's kind of happening in this very pseudo way. And so I'm feeling into this question of like right relationship. And what I've loved about listening to you, Tim, is I feel you championing this orientation that I think the further you go into like spiritual spaces, the less common it becomes. Like there's kind of that more imminent scientific integrity, whilst kind of still willing to go to the edges. And I think that the other piece for me is just a very specific kind of curiosity around like how does spiritual practice change when coming through the lens of this more kind of imminent view of the virtual. I think a lot of spiritual practice is just drenched in this more kind of emanationist, essentialist view. And I think that's what I'm really feeling into in my life, is a kind of spirituality that does sort of maybe slightly emphasize that way around. I have these two sound bites came through before that I've heard you when you're speaking to Matt, Tim. One was It was something like, and I'm paraphrasing, but you were just kind of expressing, I don't know if it was matter, but like the way matter or something like that is exceeding the one, like it's exceeding oneness. And then this like real strong emphasis on local teleology. And I'm really curious, like taking those two pieces, like what does that look like to kind of enact and live into as like a shaping of one's phenomenology?
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, so I think we can hold those. I think we can keep those there. That was really nicely done. Joan, Beck, or Aspasia, you're quite welcome to step in or not.
I'll let Aspasia go first. I just wanted to check back in with Tom. What was that last connection you made to phenomenology there?
I think just kind of because it's spiritual practice, situating it in the first person and what is then happening experientially if we kind of take that metaphysics and we roll it out in participation.
I think to do with the local teleology piece is right there, which is again like how does the participation in how we receive the world and mediate our relationship as experience in that most local, immanent sense. But the notion of purpose or teleology in that regard actually connect with broader participation then? So it's in a sense like, like one way to think is kind of like, is this personal manifestation thing? Is that like a real thing? Not, that's obviously too reductive, but there's something about that, right? Well, if I just have the thoughts and then maybe it enacts like something on the bigger picture, that's not quite what Tom's saying, but there's something in there there's something in there which I think is relevant. But Aspasia?
This has all been great. I really don't have a lot to add. I'll maybe just share like a couple of strands that I'm curious around. So if I think about my work as a therapist, I guess where this becomes most relevant for me is the sense that there just are these very real clumps. I don't know how else to explain it. Just these sort of clumps of the chunks of time where everyone comes in and there's just a sense of the way they speak about their challenges, their difficulties, what it is that they're grappling with, the way they start speaking about it. It's very clear that they have been captured by something, right? There's this sort of capturing that goes on. And I think that's probably, I will be listening to most of this and participating in most of this through that lens of just like, I am really curious about all the other ways that this is being talked about as well. But it's when you are working with people in that way every day, it's very clear. And there's a real sad, like, I mean, it can go both ways, but there is a real sadness to it in lots of cases too. It's like a brainwashing as opposed to, it's like so sometimes this is functioning from my point of view, like an eradication of a person's, autonomy or, ability to have spontaneity of language to put to their experience. It's this real sort of, it's already like a predefined, I've been on social media. I've been on Reddit. I know exactly what's going on for me. Here's the recipe. Here's what everyone told me I should get you to do for me, not do for me. If you do that, you're doing, like, it's all laid out for them, and I'm not needed. And yeah, I mean, that's obviously fruitful because that's a good place to start, right, in the discussion of that. But I guess I just want to throw that piece in as well, that there is a way that, at least for me, in a very practical sense, this can function like an additional web of junk to get through. Sometimes it's not always junk, but there is people can wear it like an armor, I guess, and it becomes an additional layer of challenge to any kind of authentic relationship that can develop, and obviously, therefore, in a relationship as well. So there's just that piece too that I've been thinking about a lot recently. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Like a static interpretation, which didn't come from local participation in actually tuning into the telos of the being, which then becomes a disenabler for actually meeting in real connection in an opening. Yeah, that's really nice to bring in, Aspasia. Thank you.
And there's
Beck.
something very different. Can I
Sorry.
just say briefly, there is something very different to my experience of that too from something more akin to sort of a Jungian archetypal kind of way of person starting to sort of describe what's happening for them. There's quite a distinct difference to the quality of it that I'm yet to put into words, but I'm sure you'll help me with today.
In a way, I love that. It's really important. And I think the mental health context, obviously, of Jung's thought, but of a lot of this is really, really important. But in a way, super briefly, what you're describing can be thought of as like you said, capture. It's identification. So it's like Jung would talk about inflation, right? And this is not necessarily inflationary, like it's not necessarily someone becoming like a toxic guru or thinking they're God or something because they've identified with an archetype, but it is the same kind of identification with a conceptual framing that comes from elsewhere and not from lived experience, right? And as you're saying, it becomes obfuscatory. People aren't able to connect with that lived experience to kind of individuate in a what might be thought of in this context as a healthier manner because of that obfuscation. And so here the notion of like a phantasm and so much anarchic or anarchistic thinking is precisely about the deconstruction, decomposition, whether it's in the history of philosophy, deconstructing these things that get in between us and, an understanding of reality or whatever, or in mental health or in politics, obviously, that's a really great, and it really speaks to what Tom was saying as well, actually, like the connection to lived experience. So yeah, that's something we can definitely, dwell on. Yeah. Thank you.
And while we were just talking about things that stood out, I would love to hear about the Book of Enoch. For no reason other than it just stood out. It seemed to illuminate itself.
Beck, would you like to bring anything in?
Hello. This is my first call on this topic. So yeah, I missed all the previous Voicecraft sessions, sadly. But yeah, this is really exciting. And I guess similar to Aspasia, I'm relating to the closest engagement in my life, which happens to be art and dance. Just thinking of how this is embraced in my practice. I haven't thought about characters in this way previously, so this is very on the fly for me right now. But yeah, just drawing back to some of the ways that we embrace certain archetypal characters in our movement and tracing back to where that really comes from. And I guess that's when it diverts to the sociological or the anthropological lens, like looking back at where that accumulative research comes from and tracing down in your own path as the individual. And then, drawing back to myself as the individual, but also as an observer of the street dance community, seeing how that varies from person to person and how different their way of embracing this character would evolve. If we look at it from like the character coming through in this egregorial sense, then it's so different as well. So yeah, I think for me it's a matter of, I don't even like being empathetic as an observer, really just trying to feel in, and then if you happen to have an exchange with the performer, then you're able to gather further context as to their way of tracing back. So yeah, I guess this is how I'm coming in this conversation. But yes, very new to this topic.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, plenty to work with there concretely. Journey, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I'd had some thoughts building up throughout, but I want to build off that last point Beck made about observing the street dance context, particularly in recent years where the attentional economy of street dance has become more commodified. And so in that sense, there's an accelerated on-ramp into the identity so that I no longer see it as reflective of real archetypal expression in their origins. When breaking originated out of the Bronx in New York, those people had a real reason to break. And now we can perform that in respect of the lineage from a distance. So our local teleology is not quite, but there is some point of resonance that we can touch in with. I do think there are some issues there in terms of it taking on a more egregorial flavor. That is something that's more of a performative character in the negative sense. So that's a really interesting point. Yeah, I wanted to go just a little bit further in terms of how I've been hearing Tom and Aspasia as well, with respect to both spiritual and psychotherapeutic domains, and how that bridges in with the artistic domain. I'll just share some of the explorations me and Beck have been engaged in recently. A few weeks back, we went to a workshop and we were given the opportunity to spend time invoking an entity through that we could move through. And one entity that I've been wanting to play with for some years now, but I haven't given myself the space to do so, is that of like Escatoya. I'm just mashing words here, but like the entity of small ends, something like this. And that's come through thematically in some of our previous conversations on intimacy or negativity in the absence of intimacy, which you could say is like the lack of localized participation. And from that, I had this like little crystallized poetic notion of a womb stone. What is the untraceable traverse between inorganic matter to life, to a space that's able to breathe that? So this would be where you could come in, Tim, on the ontogenetic / epigenetic element. I'm really interested in that. And I do see a lot of convergence between what each of our interests are as it relates to growth beyond the scaffolds that can come to stifle us. Yeah.
Part of me, for the sake of people listening, I wonder, like, I could bullet point through some of the threads which do seem to link. I know you've kind of got them all anyway, Tim. I don't know if that would be helpful. This is one of the questions. Is it helpful from like a role-based perspective here? I'm curious, like, you know what I mean? Like, is it helpful for that? So I'll just do it real quick. It's something like revealed and or created dimensions as new forums, niches for participation and our role in influencing those, magnified by the lens of local participation in telos and spiritual practice, then kind of embodied in the examples of people either being too prescripted, entering therapeutic contexts, not in fact open to that new valley crossing and real relating on the way there, but then also personified in the examples of dance of old patterns maybe being sort of commoditized rather than actually lived. But then at the same time, there's a sort of seeking question there around what is it to actually organically do something that looks a little bit more like the 0 to 1. I mean, you could think inorganic to organic as a 0 to 1, but I think that's probably one of the things that's going to be collapsed a little bit here. But there's a tension there as to, again, what is it to participate in creativity, right? How do we locate ourselves together so as to not just be sort of commoditizing and sort of regurgitating, but actually genuinely traversing the novel and creating in a more enriched way conducive toward life and value and that kind of thing. So anyway, Tim, there you go. Take it away.
Yeah, well, great summary. I mean, there's so many, apparently disparate threads, but I think they are all very much related, and they relate to this. For me, they relate very much to this notion of a kind of operative schema that is differentially instantiated in all of these areas, right? So there are what would be called by someone like Simondon, or not someone like Simondon, operative analogies. Like, we can understand the relationship between a number of the different things that are being discussed in terms of a similar kind of pattern of you could say becoming or ontogenesis, as opposed to the alternative, which has come up a number of times, which is some kind of complete capture by something preformed or pre-existing that we mold ourselves in the image of, so where we become the kind of passive matter, understanding ourselves in accordance with a kind of template that is given to us in some sense. And there are, obviously, there are positive and negative ways of framing that kind of thing. We can think of like a bequest, like the collective, both synchronically but also diachronically. History gives us a great deal to work with. And those are these dimensions of collectivity which enable us to become, ourselves in some sense. That's not a phrase that I like, becoming ourselves. It's cryptically essentialist, but what I'm saying. Like, we're able to do something unique, a unique variation on those themes that are given to us by the collective. But there's always this concern, right, that bequest or gift is in some sense becomes authoritarian. It becomes a kind of there are these words in sort of psychoanalytic theory. Yeah, homophones, but different spellings, interpolation and interpolation, right? So, we are interpellated with an E and a double L into some structure that massively, exceeds us, but is predefined. And then we find our place in that, like some part in a predefined whole, which, just as an aside, is why organicist metaphors can actually be really pernicious and totalitarian as well. Like, everything is fraught with some danger here. And interpolation is when we take something from outside and stick it into our psyche, and so you can think of like super egoic function in that way, like norms and strictures and rules and things that come from the collective that we internalize and that then shape us. And that, again, those things can be both positive and negative, right? So we have to somehow sit with that tension. And this is always a challenge in trying to forward something that is more or less, anarchistic or ontogenetic in this very radical sense. It's like, oh, what do you mean, like complete chaos then, complete randomness, no inheritance whatsoever? And it's not that at all, of course. So these archetypal operators that we're discussing are very much present in that sort of conception. It's just, again, that no particular archetype can become the arche or, preside over a domain in some complete manner and be allowed to basically conceal its own genesis. Like, this is one of the ways that, this kind of authoritarian notion, installs itself as a kind of eternal, beyond questioning, right? Some higher transcendent power that we as limited finite humans are in no position to question, etc. Something that does, in fact, one might argue, I would argue, have a contingent historical origin, genesis, but then once it reaches a certain degree of formation, it conceals that genesis, right? It's like, no, nothing, nothing to see there, no history there. It's always been this way. This is the way it is. This is the natural given, all of that kind of stuff. Pernicious concepts of nature with a capital N. Everything. And I mean, that speaks to me very directly into some of what Aspasia was talking about. And again, there's a double bind here, or a double-edged sword, or a pharmacon, positive and negative benefits of diagnosis, right? That would be one of the things we could talk about, and I think Aspasia is speaking specifically to a kind of social media influenced, self-diagnosis in a way, like, oh, I've already done the research. I just, I need you to sign me off as X. I've already got my identity, which is mediated through that apparatus. I need you to confirm, because you've got the authority to do so, my identity. But there's of course that authority that these medical, the medicalization, the medical establishment has. It's quote unquote scientific. It's evidence, blah blah blah. The DSM, the ICD, whatever your diagnostic manual is. There's always a danger of seeing those diagnostic categories as natural kinds, really they're, as we know, like, they're symptom clusters, right? And they often, they denote some kind of adaptive conflict that a person is in between, a broader context, their life, their position in society, their family, whatever it is. And they're manifesting these very real symptoms, which are causing a very real suffering. But the diagnosis, the diagnostic approach is just a way of organizing those things schematically and associating them with treatment outcomes, right, or treatment plans, right? And that can be instrumentally very useful and very powerful, and it can be validating in a good way for people to be diagnosed. But at the same time, it can also become another kind of oppressive imposition of identity. And you see that very directly in addiction, when people identify as addicts. I am the kind of person who keeps doing this thing, that's a good self-fulfilling prophecy right there. And so, one of the things we're kind of talking about in this context is a kind of addiction to identification as well, right? It's like, I need this conceptual, mediator, this framework to understand myself. That, of course, could be thought of in terms of an egoic addiction to a kind of petty narrative self, blah, blah, blah. So there's all of that. I loved everything that you guys were saying. I love the connection between the therapeutic and the artistic. This is a really big thing for me in my own, music practice. And so there's a whole conversation we can have about improvisation in this context and enabling constraints on improvisation. So again, these archetypal operators can be a kind of enabling constraint on an improvisation, which would then become, very context specific, here, now, never again kind of thing, right? And that would be very much the same, of course, in dance, with characters that you're talking about, and the way different individuals can completely, bring a character to life, but in a very different way. So there's a shared kind of enabling constraint that pre-exists these different, performances, but the performances are themselves, uniquely irreducible and all of that. That, of course, would be the case with musical form, which, again, in dance, but in music as well, with a song, think of a jazz standard, think of a blues song or whatever, some pre-existing framework that actually affords the opportunity for a situation specific, and again, like irreducible expression. And so some of that is all going to feed into this kind of the irreducible reality of what, I have all my sort of abstract categories, but, what I think of as firstness or prosaic, right? Lived experience, and it's, the fact of its irreducibility to any speculative framework, right? So even though there are these conceptual frameworks for example, that both enable us to have certain kinds of experiences. They create these contexts in which we can, they contribute to the creation of contexts in which we can have experiences, and also enable us to understand those experiences, right? So this happened to me, and now I find a narrative framework which helps me to contextualize that and understand that. And and all of that. There is, of course, always some excess to what Tom was bringing up of the lived experience itself, right? So the abstract, essentially the generality, which is the category or whatever, right? And at the limit, it becomes a universal with a capital U. But, I always say, like, the, generality, universality, the more you generalize, the more particularity you're going to lose, or the more specificity you're going to lose, which is obvious. It's tautological to say that, right? But it's just always worth, repeating. So, I guess part of the question is, like, how can we have these experiences of particularity, or how can we attend to the particularity which is always present to us, without a kind of a priori capture, a priori canalization, or whatever, a priori reduction to some kind of pre-existing category. And it seems to be the case for a lot of us that our not necessarily peak experiences. I mean, yes, peak experiences, but just experiences where we feel particularly, fulfilled and everything, are associated with a certain, hopefully not too uncharacteristic, but perhaps not exactly normal presence and attention and engagement in some kind of very lived, very specific context, where more of the detail of our lived reality is showing up for us than maybe does at other times. And I guess a lot of practices that we get into, which I would think, dance is like that, but certainly meditation practices, listening practices, all of this kind of stuff is sort of oriented towards, having more, developing our capacity for more of that, present, prosaic, again, detail to show up for us. And I think, that's very relevant to this. So I want to get to this notion of the local telos, and why I think, local telos is the kind of the only telos in some sense, right? It's just that loci can exist at very different scales. But I wonder if it might be helpful to read really quickly a little quote from Simondon on ethics, right? So, Simondon is very influenced by Jung, and I do think of this in a Jungian context. But Simondon's philosophy is this radical philosophy of ontogenesis and individuation, right? And you can think of this if you've ever read Jung on psychotherapy. The Practice of Psychotherapy is a great collection of Jung essays, and him talking about, yes, I have these speculative schemas. Yes, I've got my psychological types. I've got all of that. I need those maps, blah, blah, blah. But, the idea when you are in the room with the analysand, right, is that you're trying to have a relationship that is not pre-mediated. So, you've studied, Jung would think of himself as studying the history of consciousness, right? So that you are prepared in a way for whatever might arise. But when you're in that encounter, when you're in that engagement, when you're in that relational context, you are putting all of that aside so that you are most able to undergo a kind of reciprocal individuation or reciprocal ontogenesis with the analysand. So essentially, these are ways can sound like trivializing, but you can be what they need you to be right now, not understanding them according to some, pre-existing model. This is one of the reasons why Jung also says that he's not a metaphysician, and why a lot of attempts to kind of, make him into a metaphysician are very problematic. And attempts to criticize him for being a little bit cowardly or too Kantian and blah, 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 these things come up a lot, are kind of missing the point that this for Jung is an ethical stricture, right? So he's really worried about the kind of inflation that he diagnoses people like Hegel and whatever, for undergoing, where they start to think that their psyche is objective reality, essentially. This is inflation for Jung, and it's this projective fantasy that's very dangerous. He's seen a lot of that with his psychotic patients from the time that he's, a very, very young practicing clinician, right? And of course, famously, he has his, he does his own schizophrenia, as he puts it, he has a big issue with this. So he's trying to work out how not to do that in certain contexts, how to have an ethical encounter. And this is predicated on openness, right? and a certain degree of vulnerability, of course, which again, double-edged sword, people can take advantage of you. We know about famous cases recently with psychedelic therapy and people being abused. And again, the issue of toxic guruism and all of this arises here. But I just want to read this Simondon quote really quickly because I think it speaks to a number of these issues. This is the very last paragraph of his very rigorous and technical primary PhD thesis, which is individuation in light of notions of form and information. The very last paragraph is, ethics is that through which the subject remains subject. For Simondon, the subject is the individual plus what he thinks of as the pre-individual, which is basically the capacity for the individual to be other than it is, right? To keep changing, right? So individuals are always relative and phasic for Simondon, and that includes archetypes, right? Those are individuated terms. So the subject remains subject, refusing to become an absolute individual, a closed domain of reality, or a detached singularity. It is that through which the subject remains in an ever-charged internal and external problematic, i.e. in a real present, right, like hink and nunk, as he would say, here and now, living on the central zone of being, neither wanting to become either form nor matter, like he's referencing this whole history that he's been talking about with holomorphism and blah, blah, blah. Ethics expresses the meaning of perpetuated individuation, the stability of becoming, that of the being as pre-individuated, individuating, and tending towards the continuous that reconstructs in an organized form of communication a reality as vast as the pre-individual system. That would require some unpacking, don't worry about that. But across the individual, understood as the amplificative transfer emerging from nature, societies become a world. So he's talking about, the ethics of reciprocal individuation in context. In relationship, individuation is always a relational process. And in so doing, this dimension, again, in scare quotes, but that he would call trans-individual is emerging. And that is the creation of shared worlds, essentially, right? And so he's, before this in this book, he's theorized, religions in terms of that kind of thing, cultures. He's talked about Jungian archetypes as affectivo-emotive themes. There's a lot of work that he's discussed to get to that kind of point. But there's something to me that's very pithy about that, that I think we're talking about, which is not being foreclosed by whatever we've inherited or picked up from the collective or whatever, but continually entering into a relationship with the collective and with the other individuals that comprise that collective in a problematic manner, like not using our understanding and our conceptual frameworks in a way that I would call apotropaic, right? So apotropaic magic wards off evil, right? So not to kind of explain away the discomfort that we have with uncertainty, with excess, with the fact that I can't fit you to my model, like something about you that I don't understand, like not always trying to perform this reduction on others. And that is, again, that's what ethics sort of entails for Simondon. So there's a way to get from there, because I've just said heaps, sorry, about, to this localized genesis of a local telos, right? So directionality emerging at the local scale. There's a whole, thing we can go through to talk about that. But also, Jern's point about the connection between, the physical and the vital. I'd like to hear more about what you intend by that question. But Simondon has himself a very particular way of understanding that relationship. And to make it very, very brief, Simondon he's anti-substantial, right? This is a big part of his philosophy, right? So you can't have as a primary or fundamental category like matter as distinct from mind, or, physical as distinct from vital, as like a fundamental substantial distinction. There's this stuff, like in Descartes, there's this stuff, mind stuff, and this is a caricature of Descartes, but, matter stuff and blah, blah, blah. Like this is the kind of thing that he's trying to think against the whole time. But he is very much trying to understand and this I think goes back to something Tim was talking about as well, like the genesis of different domains and how those domains are related to each other. And this whole notion that I've talked about the operative analogy between domains becomes key there. So like the big domains he's talking about, I don't love the term domain, but whatever, are physical, vital, psychic, and collective. All right. And so part of his project is like, how do those things hang together? They seem to be different, but we don't want to have recourse to like an absolute difference between physical, quote unquote, matter or whatever and mind. You know, we don't want to reinstantiate this mind matter problem, blah, blah, blah. So he goes to all these different sciences, and particularly physics and biology, and tries to understand how certain operations are differentially manifest in those different zones. But in, very brief, a big difference between physical individuation occurs in the physical domain, so to speak, right? And vital individuation is that in physical individuation, there's a possibility of completion. So like a crystal or a form is taken and it completes that process. And he would say it kind of fully depletes the charge of pre-individual problematics that drive that process. So here you can actually achieve a state in which a form becomes fixed for a very, very long period of time, right? Whereas in vital individuation, that relationship with a problematic pre-individual charge, and charge has this double valence. Of course, there's like an electrical and thermodynamic notion that he's talking about, but also it's charged like burden, right? Like you're carrying this charge. You are charged with, this is the ethical thesis, you are charged with ongoing individuation, like someone like Deleuze would say, being worthy of the event, being worthy of what happens to you, or blah, blah, blah. But this is the key thing that what distinguishes life operationally from the, inorganic, non-vital domain is that living systems are continually carrying that charge. So they continually undergo a kind of differentiating individuation onto genetic movement. And so in a very Darwinian mode now, because this is kind of Darwin's conception as well, variation for Darwin, variation is always produced in excess, right? So the excess production of variation is Darwin's first posit, and then selection acts on that. But it's not acting on a predefined, field of variation or whatever. It's acting on something that is itself generative and continuously overproducing generation. But that's how we're going to get, if we go there, to the genesis of like local teloi. So it's not like global teleology, that's out, totally out, because that's prefamationism and all of that. But it's how do we orient ourselves, or how do living systems do this and whatever, in very specific contexts, to move in particular directions, to not only achieve goals, but to, deviate goals, like to generate novel goals, etc. Right. So the Darwinian and Simondonian thing is like a pluralization, an immanentization, and thus a pluralization of purposes. It's not an evacuation of purpose at all. Some people think that about Darwin. No, it's about pluralizing purpose, right? So function, etc. Organisms have goals. They're intending to do things. Obviously, we have goals, but there isn't a single unified goal behind everything. And this is, just for the philosophical history gloss, this is how Darwin completely deviates the kind of Aristotelian legacy, where Aristotle is pretty clear that he doesn't believe that purpose can arise from non-purpose. Like everything has to be always already purposeful for Aristotle, and there might be deviations from purpose, but they're going to be ironed out, right? They're going to be subjugated by the overriding purpose that always envelops everything. And the Darwinian kind of reversal or whatever, or inversion or whatever of that is like, no, things start without purpose, but then they are through relation, which is selection, in a lived context. There's a shared reciprocal orientation. It's ecological. Selection is an ecological function, and that's how we actually get orientation and direction. I'll stop.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. Well, again, I want to be respectful of everyone who's sort of present in the field with this. I feel I was with you every step of the way there. And there are places that I am motivated to take this, which I think want to push to the edges a little bit. But again, I want to be respectful of what's present. So if anybody feels like it would be really important to find their way into the channel so they can stay, metabolizing and integrating this well enough to continue, then I'll give a little space for that now.
I just want to say briefly, there's been something along the way that I've been noticing about just the knitting together of different styles of language and all of this. And I was most struck by actually when you were talking, Jen, sort of like this movement from you were talking in quite a poetic way about, I think it was the womb stone. And then what followed that was this sort of, and then just this very from in the next sentence, sort of this shift back into sort of the terms, the more scientific terms. And there's something about that. The reason I bring it up is because there's something about all of this too. If I just go back to my little kind of lens, that part of what I think people are grappling with is the language around all of this and how to use language. And I know that's what we're doing today, obviously, but there is so much emphasis on talk and talking about these things. And that's a real problem too with people from my perspective, people coming into therapy. It's the expectation is just like rapid fire speaking. And that can be its own kind of identification, I think, with something that we could get into. But the importance in all of this around, individuation comes with a lot of waiting and sensing and gestating and holding and feeling and all of these things that there seems to be some, I think, true engagement with something that would be maybe more archetypal in nature, if we call it that, is being lost in the mix because of a much more kind of superficial attempt to talk as much as possible about things. But for people to keep up with that, I think that they are appealing to things like Reddit forums and, they don't know that, and so they are just kind of swimming in the sea of here's the language for how to talk about what's going on for you. And which I don't want to imply I'm trying to be completely negative about, and I understand can be very well intentioned and has its use. But what am I trying to say? There is, if we're going to talk about identification, there is some sort of like identification with. I've got words to speak about this in a way that are understandable to my group of people and here, and we can share in our language together about them, and therefore I feel understood and like I belong, something like that, which can be helpful on one level, but at the same time can cut oneself off from the process of individuation, from my point of view, which I don't think is adding anything new, but there's something
absolutely
coming up that was important.
Yeah, I often make distinction between received authority and then authorship authority. And I think one of the things in the context of Voicecraft and being able to use language well without language serving as a proxy for, momentarily seeking to resolve a need to situate oneself in some security, social security context. What is the expert received authority that can demarcate the norm for me, that can reduce the anxiety or whatever else, versus actually, again, participate in relationship, show up in that local context, share in authorship. And I think that is one of the challenging things as well. Often also the distinction you've heard me make many times between holding space and sharing space, that even in more of the spiritual transformative communicational contexts, which in principle can have a certain kind of radical group energy associated with them that you may not find in more of the expert world of Western medicine, where group therapy in general is not so much, part of the clinic, although it might be, here and there, of course. There's this notion, obviously, of holding space, but are you really in your preset script of what the form needs to be, actually enabling the possibility of people to become, and really get to know each other and share and all of that. So excuse me one moment while I let the cat out. Yeah, the place that I wanted to invite us toward, and it is more challenging because I, largely agree, and I feel that what's been spoken to is a really awesome languaging of what can be known in creative relationship across different kinds of mediums, and that can be also realized in conversation and in language, obviously at different levels. But one of the most confounding things, I think, for human beings is relating to different time rhythms. Back when I began podcasting, I used to call it sort of the problem of many durations, which does not have a very good ring to it. But, anyone who's seen a time lapse of a forest or something, just looking at what, at least at the level of analogy, looks like something much more akin to a sensory motor loop at a different time scale across an ecology, while not being obviously at the kind of the rhythm of the heartbeat of mammals and, organisms with the sensory motor loop that we'd recognize in the nervous system and whatever else. Now, I'm not saying it is a sensory, how reductive are we being when it comes to what is in a process of individuation? Where exactly are the demarcating lines of the local, both in space and also across time? And I think that is one of the great challenges here. And the reason why I put it as something which points towards an edge is because, it asks us to really be careful with our meaning of local, and, held in the right way. I think that very much remains, again, from the perspective of immanent participation. But I would then look to open the notion into how our capacity for receptivity, which brings in that point, that Tom is kind of pointing to a little bit with the spirituality. And then, I'll see receptivity in the context of the second person as something that we can cultivate together and needs to be cultivated together. So Tim, you use the kind of firstness of, as something like the irreducible, suchness of what, that is part of reality. But then how we participate with each other so as to actually cultivate the receptivity to our entanglements is, for me, something really right on the edge across a number of conversations at the moment, and even comes out when I'm speaking with someone like Dave Snowden as a place of critique, which I want to approach with him more and more in conversation, because often what is taken for granted is approaching transformation given an already set context or an organization or a group to work with. And even in his case, he's wanting to be as careful as it's possible to be around what influences the facilitator or change agent is bringing into the process. The activity of co-locating ourselves in relationship and in a metabolic process that can actually belong together for long enough to undergo work is, for me, a step that's not taken out there. Now, that can be analyzed at levels of class and economics and politics in ways which are obscured in discourse for a whole bunch of reasons which are very concrete. but which look far away from philosophical discourse, except they are fundamental actually to the mediation of philosophical discourse as something which is actually appropriately in touch with vitality. And so how we go about perceiving what the locality of participation or possibility for relationship is critical at a number of these levels. I began by speaking about, well, at the level of time and space, we as human beings, in a sense, obviously classically are in the middle of things. In medias res is a phrase that you will hear philosophers use all the time, right? We have the microscopic of the quantum and the macroscopic of the cosmic. And there's this, drive in human beings, whether through science or mysticism, to connect these magisteria in a sense. And yet there's this continually lurking challenge, perhaps, of our archetypal setup, what we can, so it's this question of extending or developing or the becoming of archetypes is for me super important, and why the virtual and the egregore becomes relevant as to what constraints and context can we create which can open up or transform our capacity for receptivity and adaptation of archetypal disposition and lens, so that we can in fact stay in vital relationship with what is always already in fact constituting us, but what could yet still constitute us, or whatever at these other levels, which ultimately inform our context of belonging, but also the fate of our belonging, or where fate and choice yet dwell unresolved, or something like that, right? So where can we actually go? How can we choose together? Like, what is it to ultimately, in a sense, the question is, how does the notion of the local, of the telos, actually situate itself with its own beyond, which isn't to say entirely pull from the beyond or give itself over ultimately to the beyond, but the local still, what is it for the local almost implies that there's some horizon, that there's, that some membrane, and how to be in relationship with that, as in the case where it's an already conditioning factor which we may not be either aware of or want to presence for various economic, institutional reasons, as well as, again, archetypal limitations at the level of cosmos, in a sense, of perception as such. That, for me, is an edge of conversation that finds its way into basically every discourse that I'm tracking, that I'm, so I'm not saying everything absolutely, right, but just where a lot of my attention is pulled. And so that's probably enough to stop there.
Well, I'm glad that you brought in the time horizon element, Tim. I was thinking along these lines, so I'm just going to share what I was going to share prior to what you've just now shared. Because it fits. I guess I should just give some of the received context, which gave rise to the wordplay of Womstone, which may at least indirectly respond to Timothy's question of the way in which I'm intending the connection between the physical and the vital. It's a metaphor that connects multiple metabolic time horizons. As an aside, I am interested in the relation between metaphor and metabolism, in that etymologically one means to hold the beyond, or to behold the beyond, and one means to throw into the beyond, respectively. So the context was something like the conversation we had maybe a few months ago on negativity in the absence of intimacy, which can be thought of as a perspective that one has failed to explore potential in a way that it then instantiates itself into a physical state that can be recognized on the time horizon of the human heart, which is to say it has some concrete contribution to that very context. That's a bit of a muddle there, but I think we were talking about tombstones initially, and we were talking about the inevitability of failure. But failure is just one way of taking, again, one's relationship to potential, where one has explored things and not been able to ground that out in a way that can be appreciated by the collective.
Yeah, I think the
So,
joke was, I said something like, and I didn't have the language of wombstone, but it was like, if there's an opposite of a tombstone, what would be written on it was, there will be errors, or something like that. Mistakes will be made. Yeah.
yeah. But we're needing those error bars because that allows for noise, and noise is necessary to learning. At least that's how I'm hearing it spoken to recently. Learning both machinically and organically. Now, I don't know how to have that be a direct response to what you were asking before, Timothy. I'm going to say Timothy just so I can differentiate. But, just this kind of mystery in the connection between the physical and the vital. But yes.
Can I just speak to that really quickly, because I think that's really important what you say, obviously, from, tying together previous conversations you guys have had, but, mistakes will be made, error, etc. The key, let's again say Darwinian for short of hand, innovation is to make the error primary, right? Is to make the deviation primary, yeah? So there isn't a universal measure against which things can be defined as accidents. This is a very classical issue, right? So for Aristotle, blah, 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 you've got essences and deviations from their own accidents, and they get cancelled out, essentially, right? The idea in the Darwinian turn, and very much in the Simondonian turn, like I mentioned, the problematic nature of the pre-individual there, is that, yeah, the error or the deviation is primary, and that's where, the measures themselves are, in some sense, going to have to come from, a process of it's basically exploration or spitballing, or, like, I'm moving around in the dark and I don't know where I'm going. I banged into a wall. Now I know where I am, like finding that's secondness, by the way, Tim, so when I said firstness is this irreducibility, firstness kind of corresponds to this variational, noise. And secondness is exactly that contextual relationship. That's how selection functions in Darwin, which orients. Yeah, so you know where you're going because you bumped into something, or somebody responded to you, or whatever it is. But at first, it was a shot in the dark. Yeah, so that's really key. So the difference between the vital and the physical in the Simondonian sense is about how the error is either kind of all pacified or turned into and increasingly harnessed as a kind of generative process. And so in a like molecular evolution context, we would say, evolution of evolvability, like how do things become more evolvable, more plastic, etc., right? And in a sense, by harnessing more error, or having more capacity basically to deviate without collapse. So Simondon would speak about internalizing more of the charge of the pre-individual or whatever. But there's obviously tons to say about this in terms of why evolution and learning are not optimization processes. So this actually being a big difference between a lot of like machinic processes of learning and like actual organic vital learning. And again, that will go back to why there isn't a global telos. Right, there's not an end that we're like globally, we're not all climbing the same mountain or descending the same gradient or whatever, right? There's a shifting landscape with a, topology which is being modified by every kind of intervention that we make. And so these mathematical models, which try and reduce processes like that to kind of single bases of reduction, which is how physical science essentially works, don't really work for the vital or the so-called organic or whatever. Yeah, I really want to speak to what Aspasia said as well, but I'll stop here for the moment because I'm actually very conscious that I do talk too much. But I want to speak specifically to that challenge, and specifically this context. But I can come back to that, and I'm also remembering you want to talk about the Book of Enoch if we're going to talk about egregores. But I'll let someone else speak first.
Can I very briefly just link in one last aspect, which was your point about moving around in the dark? Because you did mention Simondon's book, which was In Light of Notions of Form and Information. And immediately I was like, okay, but in the shadow of these ideas as well is where we can potentially play. And that was one of the mediums that me and Beck were encouraged to explore, the play of light and dark. It was really interesting seeing how movement could be portrayed in relation to darkness, not just as having a spotlight on stage and then moving the body into it, but letting the darkness and the light become their own entities that you then relate with in more complex ways. And I do think there's something there, at least from an artistic perspective, which might bridge to where Aspasia is going.
Love that.
Not that I'm clear on that.
Love that. I would say just for Simondon, ultimately, or this is the way I interpret these things, like the only maximally general principle is indefiniteness, essentially, right? So like at the limit, we always encounter the dark, if you want, you know? So there's always an event horizon. There's always this is kind of, well, we don't need to throw more names. Throw more names at the issue. That is one of the challenges of having these kinds of conversations, which are, to me, I'm always trying to contextualize it in a kind of history of philosophy, conceptual history. I'm trying to derive shared operators because I think, look, there's so many things flying around that we need to coordinate our understanding. But I understand that, not paradoxically so much as ironically, that can become a barrier to the understanding of others as well. You know, if I just tell, that's how so-and-so thinks about it and so-and-so, and I've got this like really refined operational schema that all this work that one has done oneself and is trying to communicate, that can become obfuscatory in and of itself. And I do think that's a particular challenge, by the way, in this kind of context, at least for me, like Zoom, right? What have we got here? I can't smell you. We've got words, right? To some extent, we get a little bit of bodily feedback from facial expression and people nodding or shaking their heads or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's like talking into a void a lot of the time with Zoom. So there can, I guess, be a tendency to overcompensate for that. But again, every conversation is different, every context is different, and it's trying to feel one's way into that and what has one been invited to discuss, etc. But yeah, I think that the dark halos in some sense in these conceptions, right? And it is the indefiniteness, which again is the possibility for being otherwise. So there's a relationship between that which is not already formed in a definite manner and deviation, ongoing genesis, etc. Right, and that's the kind of thing that Simondon was trying to theorize, despite the title "In Light of," right? But trying to theorize and thematize in terms of pre-individuality. Like pre-individuality is underdetermination or indefiniteness, the capacity to be otherwise.
Well, it's actually that's really well said. That can be a way of describing the quality of listening, which opens up perception of the richness of the medium available in Zoom, which is far and away additional to, the reduction to nodding and whatever else, right? As someone who's obviously done, thousands of hours of in relation to this exact challenge of where discourse, but then also authorship and the encouragement of cultivating understanding and voice and all of that has to bring in all these different elements, attending to the edges, what is searching to find its distinction, but it is in a process of some sort of indifferentiation, but is orienting, is a profound contact with subjectivity. And, by and large, people, most of the world doesn't get that. They get it because they just enjoy relationship with each other. But in not recognizing, this has become so interested in how do you describe that from a substrate perspective? That can often end up being quite reductive around, well, what actually are the mediums that are operating in our field of communication? And as you've kind of said, where does the archetype live? You can't reduce it, not just biology, not just this and that. And so it's often like pointing to the medium of communication as such. And I do think, and there are still really open questions where science and a certain kind of mysticism come together in speculation with respect to this question of communication and what informs our orientation. That sense one has of what someone is trying to express, maybe it's because you've been there before, maybe, but maybe also, was it you that was there? Was it a dream? Is it a note of music which is, evocative of a constellation, a chord that you've heard before, or that your body knows exists or is possible even though you've never heard it? What is love? When you interact with people, like why fall in love with someone? What is going on? Like what is the seeking quality, of the being that in a sense is perfect as it is, right? You wouldn't change it because it is what it is, and you fall in love with that person, and yet at the same time it's also in a process of becoming, and obviously. And so there's something about the place where the striving toward the most clarified discourse, as in a process of clarification of discourse, rather than being too ostentatious about what constitutes clarified discourse, but the striving towards clarified discourse in its most masterful, I think, is in a sense also at one with the most guttural, almost like the most guttural of mediation of communication on a football pitch. I really do see it like that, that there's an edge of the point of breakdown or connection takes on a rather similar quality, so and the mediums that support our attunement to that is a really profound question, and also to turn it on its head in a sense becomes also a context for considering in what ways we're most manipulable. And so it has this edge to it. And because, again, if we're speaking about things like where our edges are of love, what we're seeking, desire, all these types of things, then we're also presencing where, in effect, we're offering up the essence of our malleability or something like that, to use a bit of a paradox, right? Just poetically. It's where are we most ripe for molding? And, we sensitively seek and reach out for that. And so we might say of Zoom, well, okay, we want to be careful that we don't open up too quickly, but it's again, this is why the relationships over time and how the field is supporting all of that and whatever else. There's many other dimensions to it. I don't think we're going to have time for a few of these other to really. So there was that as one sort of clarification in a sense about for me, because it makes imminent the discussion to the medium and the modality of the medium, and that's always been the meta message, which people mishear meta again as something which can't be embodied, right? But a meta which is not embodied is in a sense also not skin in the game relating to what its own beyond is, right? And that becomes that abstract intellectualizing worthy of criticism, you know. But the question is, you know, what kinds of processes, contexts, Aspasira, I guess skip Enoch. Well, maybe we return straight up. Maybe we should just do a session on sort of Enoch and, you know, and mysticism or something like that. But it ends up coming down to how in touch are we with the mediums of communication, in a sense, and how much of our individuating process can we bring to that in relation to the sort of the collective need of its own. Also, that's anyway too much to get back onto.
Can we just say, Tim, because that was all, you know, wonderful, and I totally agree. You know, there's a mode of engagement appropriate to a context or a medium is basically what we're saying, you know, and I do think that the what I was just getting at is that the verbal is, you know, the mode of engagement that is particularly emphasized in a Zoom context, right? As opposed to other things we might do in a more, you know, embodied context. And, you know, thinking about psychotherapy, all these different approaches to psychotherapy, you know, dance has been brought up in this regard. We could think about, like, you know, improvisation, Jacob Moreno and that kind of thing. That, you know, what you were speaking to about trying to draw out what someone is trying to say, or those edges at the limits of expression and things. That's, of course, like you know, that's like you could say like a Lacanian approach or something, but like quilting the narrative in a particular way. It's like, what is the person trying to say? And that, what I was talking about with Jung before, like being open and receptive to being able to respond in an appropriate manner, basically. But I think this really feeds back into this question about the locus, right? How do we define the local? And I guess for me, you know, this would be a persistent theme in the way that I think. But again, the locus, the locale, is an operation. It's an operator. It defines a kind of field of relational interaction. And at the moment, our locus is this Zoom meeting, right? And so there's a particular way that relation takes place in this kind of location. And it can be operatively analogized to the way relation takes place in other locations. That's kind of what we're doing, you know, when we're talking about ontogenesis and receptivity and selection and all of these sorts of things, you know, and it operates in a particular way in a particular context. And so that, you know, means that the notion of a location is a kind of, you know, scale-free or whatever, you know, you want to use a voguish term, operation. Loci can be defined at any scale. But for me, one of the key things that is being discussed here when we're talking when I'm saying, you know, that this is an anarchistic kind of thought and we're trying not to let something foreclose the possibilities of engagement and whatever. And I'll say this like in a jargonistic way, but then I'll try and unpack it. But it's just to say there is no locus of loci, which means that there is no single location that all the sub-locations fit into, right? There are all these locations and they are related to each other and whatever, but it doesn't all, you know, come tied up together in a nice, neat package, you know, one with a capital O that subsumes everything else, basically. And that is a real key principle for ontogenetic thought. And just, you know, history of philosophy stuff, a key way that this differentiates itself from so much prior thinking. Because so much prior thinking is predicated on the idea that for things to be relatable at all, for things to hang together at all, like for metaphysics to be possible as a discourse, everything would have to be bound up together in some primordial unity. And that's what's being rejected here in favor of an immanentist and ethical stance towards an ongoing, you know, individuation, a capacity to be in diverse loci, either to be, yes, like you were suggesting, Tim, different people in different contexts, if you want, right? But being receptive to something very context specific, very, yes, ecological, without always having recourse to something, primordial, something overarching. And that's the thing that always that does kind of threaten in a discussion of the archetype or the archetypes or whatever, as opposed to like archetypal operations or archetypal operators or whatever, where we try and tweak the language just a little bit to get us out of a kind of crypto substantializing, unificatory, unitary, whatever. And this is obviously so difficult to think, right? Because rational frameworks, rationalization has always been predicated on, the unitary relationship between alpha and omega, like the capacity to retrodict the past to reach a primordial unity, and thus the reciprocal capacity to predict the future, based on those initial conditions and entangling laws in physics or whatever. But and we feel very adrift sometimes, scared and uncertain when we unmoor ourselves from that kind of overarching framework where we know everything happens for a reason, or it's all gonna come out where we want it to in the end, or whatever.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, I agree. There's one of the additional confounding things, which I think is a critical part of this, is recognizing obviously certain constraints over the course of history, which are lengthy operators, right? So you talk about metamediums of communication and different things. So the internet, different economic systems, artificial intelligence, the kind of dynamics which, if they are not sort of presenced or endeavored to be understood well, are going then. And so if they're out of awareness, like they're functioning in the shadows, except are in a sense kind of enacting they are their own center or an attractor of a way, though there's a sort of pulling potential through them. And so across the different time horizons, there is this, it's a curious thing about what we end up submitting to. It's like, oh, well, the dream of Marx, or at least certain interpretations of Marx, may be proved to be sort of historically untenable, and the possibility of a global class consciousness coming online to usher in a new era is sort of just wrong, or something like this, because there's the level of the national and other factors which are more in play at the level of how people bind to each other. I was going to take that on somewhere in terms of, there's something in there. There's something at the. Now I'll have to step back to another level and just, I'm trying to leave the thought as a closing orientation for continuing this conversation, to attempt to situate ourselves within dreams which sort of prove themselves to be untenable, but then also dreams which are that we are inexorably bound to play out, in a sense, partly because our groping toward their finish in the way that a dream progresses is that we're kind of constituted by that dream, in a sense. And so the ethics of attending to when to let go of a dream, or accept a sinking further into one, or going along with each other into one, is for me super, super interesting, because in a sense, like, both may be, whatever I'm sinking further into now, without claiming that as the center is the ultimate center which accounts for all kind of possible localities, is nevertheless might be a kind of local portal that together we are collectively manifesting our way through. And so the point about Marx is that there's, there is a certain historical progression of our relationship to the sort of the necessity of contingency, our necessary bounding to contingent pathways, and being able to differentiate when we are kind of accepting our place in time and space, the hill to die on, so to speak. And nevertheless, that's not just a local hill in the sense of just me, but that may be for others too. And that's super interesting. So to recognize to fully accept the point you made, and at the same time to be part of contexts which are kind of sort of affirming the kind of the inexorability of local closure or something like that, as a way of actually progressing through into openness. I'm not saying it should always be the case, but like that's where the potential joy and pain of the ethics of this really lives, I think.
Yeah.
So
Tim, yeah, absolutely. I mean, a locus, the notion of a locus, a location, implies a degree of closure. So we're talking about the relativization of closure rather than, making it absolute at any given time. So there's always the possibility that this locus will relate to another locus or whatever, or that there is some radical alterity to all loci. That is a kind of generative difference that can be entered into relationship with and deviate the locus. I mean, the issue of closure obviously is a really big one in theoretical biology. We don't need to go there, but when it's absolutized, it's an idealization and it's a barrier to ongoing. So it's empirically false, but it's also a barrier to ongoing genesis. But like bringing the Marx thing in, like not so much the teleology of, this is the progression of history and, we're going to end up in some communist utopia or whatever. But I think the useful idea there, or a useful idea there, is commodity fetishism. And I think that's part of what we're talking about as well, because, that is, again, the concealment of genesis. Right. So it's the idea that the thing just appears as it is, and doesn't have this, all this labor and possibly exploitation and blah, blah, blah behind it. And that's one of the recurrent themes for me, that, commodity fetishism is a particular manifestation, particular theorization of a concealment of genesis, which is precisely how all the loci, all the archetypes, all the canals, all of the creodes in Waddington's sense, but canals, right? The basins of attraction get relativized. Their contingency, yes, the necessity of contingency for sure, but their contingency is specifically revealed, their non-absolute status. But of course, the thirdness, if we're talking about this, evolutionary triad, I've mentioned firstness and secondness, so sort of like variation and selection, is inheritance, right? So, it's saying that, of course, inheritance is an absolutely key part of this. And it's not a binary situation where we've got, absolutely formed and rigid, closed and whatever, and abject, chaos or abject dissolution. What we end up with is a something I've referred to elsewhere as like a temporal hierarchy of constraints. I don't love the term, but there are different layers. This would be where we would get into like in medias res again, right? And the generative middle ground, the metaxu between these different layers, realities like organisms, but reality in general has a kind of layer cake nature to it. And there are different temporal scales, there are different spatial scales, blah, blah, blah. And it's the liminal spaces, the interstices where these different scales interact, in which they deviate one another. So yeah, it's never a matter of saying that we're trying to get rid of loci altogether or inheritance altogether or anything of that that extreme. But it is still nonetheless a very extreme and radical thing, because it's saying, well, all of those forms of definiteness that constrain and enable us have their own genesis, are subject to a kind of relativization, which is a barrier against their absolutizing.
Yeah, no, I hear you. We are coming from the same place. There's a few ways I'd take this on. I mean, to sort of emphasize the ethics of orientation, and so there's something about because of how foundational grounding philosophy in sort of nature as changeless, already pre-formed in a sense, is, then there does seem to be this need to continually return to sort of ward off crypto instantiating some absolutizing appeal. And the motivation for that is important. And it's the same motivation that has me draw thought back to, or awareness to, what kind of mode of interaction or treatment of each other occludes or disenables or enables an ethics of relating in the liminality. But then to care about an ethics of participation without appeal to absolute ground in the first sense, we're already in a place of thinking that is wanting to situate or communicate the integrity of activity, relation, in process, that it's just well departed from that initial view. And yet there's language that would be helpful in a sense. It's so tricky, because it's almost as if our language is, its lineage evokes that a whole different model, but the desire for being able to affirm integrity as such remains foundational or critical, like structurally necessary. And yet it's always to be living, it's always to be lived. I do think, I wish I really was able to get through that quicker and with more clarity, because there are actually some points I wanted to emphasize, the particular complications I was trying to add to the picture in terms of our remaining open to what prior aspects of the layer cake that you described, which we may have atrophied our understanding of or capacity to operate, which would themselves look like recourse to something which could be perceived as attempting to make itself absolutely, or at least absolutely all important, but that nevertheless I still think is relevant to consider as potentially like civilizational level project in terms of like the sensorial capacities of human beings. and there's questions as to the dimensionality, in a sense, of participating in the physical world, which are of course relevant in terms of how the history of science has progressed in our understanding of cosmos, and may still progress. And so it is curious. On the one hand, there is kind of like it's kind of like the table stakes training ground of not being like a beholden to or addicted to a certain kind of absolutizing, while at the same time needing to be able to affirm time horizons or time rhythms or structures, which are, of course, evolutionary, massive, and will have more or less, pragmatically speaking, absolute effects on our possibility of communication. Obviously, chop my head off, no more conversation with us. This is a constraint that will have to be observed. Although I suppose, AI and whatever else. So anyway, we'll bring it to a close. I'll offer Tim some closing remarks. I've been so well behaved, but in the last 20 minutes, I was too excited to try and bring in the generative onwards of this rather than attend to it as a piece of closed media, which I think ends up, just churning the waters from the perspective of the listener. So I partly apologize for that, but it's obviously it's too much of a, something worth appreciating for our being together, the onward creative possibility of where all this stuff goes. So anyway, over to the rest of you for just some short final comments, and we'll bring this to a close.
Yeah, I don't really know where I would go with this, but religion has been coming up a lot. And I'm really curious about religion through your lens, Tim. Yeah, and then just in that last bit there, I was also thinking about Whitehead. I can't quite remember what you think of eternal objects, Tim, but I know you were sort of, yeah. But something about that felt important there as well, like that reconciling of the primordial and the consequent. But yeah, I guess I just wanted to land with some appreciation for you, Tim. Like, I really enjoy your passion. My guilty confession is I've listened to you and Matt's series twice. I just found it.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it is. It's you guys are absolute nerds, and I fucking love it. So yeah, it's just really appreciate that. Yeah, super fresh and really on the edge. So keep it up.
Appreciate that, man. Thanks. Before I speak, Beck or Jen, do you have anything?
Yeah, I'm just also very appreciative of understanding what it is to create our own little local theology in this micro scale here, which was fun. And yeah, hearing all the possibilities which you brought forth, Timothy. I'm going to do the same Timothy thing. Yeah, it was a very fruitful conversation. There was a lot, but it was really nice to navigate that collectively. And I enjoyed how Tim also just brought that back into context for what that means to come together to this membrane. So yeah, it was this like warping experience. And yeah, nice to have different voices come through. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. And thanks for your contributions. And, a whole aspect of this discussion is, for me, art and improvisation. I just taught a course for Acid Horizon Research Collective, and I had a whole module on, because Ontogenic Thought was the course, and I had a whole module on music and improvisation and all of that. So that's something I would love to dig into more with you guys, coming from that dance perspective as well, because I love to dance, but I'm not a trained dancer. I'm a musician, but yeah, there'd be lots to talk about there. And again, the psychotherapeutic aspects of those things are really, really, important to discuss. Tim, other Tim and I, we could obviously just go on forever, because I think we, keep hashing out some of these issues and different ways of saying the same thing, but not exactly the same thing, but, coordinating that shared way of speaking. And I think that's wonderful. I mean, yes, of course, like when I speak of a temporal hierarchy of constraint and the notion of a locus, you might know from discussions that I've had with Matt. I mean, sounds like Tom would definitely know, but, I talk about, the quote unquote laws of physics or the cosmic epoch or whatever as a locus, right? And so, yes, if we cut your head off, you wouldn't keep, but a radical deviation of the laws of physics is probably going to make it impossible for us to use this technology, or possibly, for us to live at all. Absolutely. So, I mean, this can be thought of, I think, fruitfully in terms of adaptation, basically. But, like all organisms share a particular environment, which includes, most of what's been, stable, in terms of physical reality. For the 4 billion years of life and the additional near 10 billion years of universal history. So yeah, there are these contexts which are, I don't like to use the term universal for very specific philosophical reasons, right? Because I'm always pointing out that even at that scale, even at the deepest history and whatever, we're not talking about something that is like eternal, universal with a capital U or whatever. So I talk about real generals. So there are real generals. I mean, this is going to speak to the Whitehead issue, right? I'm not going to get into that, Tom, now, because it's a big discussion. I think that with Whitehead, generally, his concepts, his operators are tracking operators that I think are real, but I just don't necessarily like the way that he constructs them, because he has too much recourse to this older history of philosophy that I'm trying to, just as I'm really interested in the possibility of being otherwise, like pre-individuality, noise, deviation, all of that kind of stuff. I'm interested, personally in the possibility of thinking otherwise. So I can't, like, even if I really agreed on some level with everything Whitehead had to say, I couldn't allow myself to, because that's like, I'd be captured. Like, he's so magisterial, his framework, that it becomes, too much, but I also just don't agree with him about those things. I find that the primordial nature of God and its relationship to the eternal objects is what I call a kind of heavy or gratuitous posit. There's too much there. Like, it's tracking a kind of real operation, but there's too much there. And in particular, I don't like his distinction between the definite and the determinate as it pertains to the eternal objects, because I don't think possibilities, lots to say for Whitehead, of course, lots of caveats. I won't get into it, but I don't think possibilities are ever definite, basically. Things aren't definite until they happen, so to speak, right? And we easily get into the illusion of thinking, I successfully predicted the future of me picking up this pen, this pacer or whatever. But it's like, what happens is never, assuming we're paying attention, exactly like our projection of a future. And again, that's kind of a key point about ontogenetic, becoming, being this kind of irreducible process, right? That it's never contained in a model, in an anticipatory logic, basically, right? It's always, in excess of that. And so, one of the things, Tim was saying, which possibly speaks to this, and the way our language can be very confining and difficult. But then, as Whitehead would say, experimenting on language is the work of, philosophy and metaphysics. But yes, there is a metaphysics, so to speak, in our grammar, and in logic, and the equation of grammar and logic with being is a real problem as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, I mean, both of you are speaking, I think, Tim and Tom, to something we could broadly speak of as, like, the necessity perhaps of revitalizing certain archaic things. You want to talk about religion, and what you could speak, obviously, in a kind of grossly and reductively evolutionary psychology terms. We don't want to, but what has the function of religion been? Obviously, we can talk etymology, religio, religare, binding together. This is something that Simondon, obviously Jung, big time, but Simondon also theorizes in terms of trans-individual domains and kind of shared resonance of affectivo-emotive themes, which are what he thinks of archetypes as. It's the way symbols work in this context. For Simondon, a symbol is it's literally like a symbolon in Greek is a half of a whole, right? So a symbol is something that is differentiated in response to an intense, experience, basically, and that then can kind of reconstitute or retrieve that experience in and of itself, right? Like, because it's half of the whole, it refers to something greater than itself. And so there's stuff we could have talked about there as well. Matt and I get into this a lot about religion and its function and what we, can and must or should and should not recover and all of that. I mean, it's a really difficult conversation. And I tend to be, especially with Matt, because he's, in a mode where he's looking to recover a lot more, specifics. Matt's whole conception is increasingly Christological. For me, I want to be a little bit more careful. That's not fair to Matt. But I'm concerned in a different way that those ideas that have so readily been co-opted by authoritarian interests, that we need to break apart the ideas more, and try to understand what is it about those ideas that makes them so readily co-opted. That is something Matt and I get into on Plato a lot, but it could be also something we could talk about in terms of Darwin, right? There's been a lot of really unpleasant, ideology that has sort of masqueraded as being Darwinian. It behooves any of us who want to inherit ideas and that have a certain reverence for ideas. It behooves us to try and understand, if it has been the case, and it often has, why those ideas have been so readily turned to pernicious ends. So, yeah, I mean, again, way too many. This is my vaguest moment of the whole talk. Too many things to talk about, but I think also what Tim is speaking to is this notion of a double bind, right? We need to be secure, like structurally integrated to enough of a degree that we don't. I mean, look, you can think about this just in terms of physics, right? An object either maintains itself to some degree, it maintains a certain degree of structural integrity, or it dissolves into its, milieu, right, into the environment. And obviously, we don't want to dissolve into our environments, but at the same time, we want to be open and flexible enough, which of course, comes along with this vulnerability, the possibility of a certain kind of dissolution or hostile takeover or whatever. But we seem to want to, everybody here seems to want to be able to engage in a kind of open-ended process, open-ended learning, lifelong learning, open-ended individuation, etc. And that's always going to be a very challenging and difficult middle ground to sit in, for sure.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. Lots there, lots to return to. And that's kind of an interesting note to finish on. How much is there to return to? And that may be, in fact, it's in that question that may be where the fruit of, well, I suppose the fruit of difference really is, in a way. That's one angle on it, because if all you did was return to Whitehead, then where is the Timothy Jackson? And so the question of how much to return to. Anyway, so yeah, the title of, I haven't told Tim this, but the book that I've been attempting to write for a while now probably is, I would love at least to release a book one day titled Becoming and Return, And so there is that, what do we mean by both of those things? But hey, at least for us here, we have, I think, a clear enough sense of where we will at least be returning to with each other at some point indefinitely in the future. So with love and thank you for everybody. Yeah. Okay.